We're going to do this thing? Let's do it. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more. I'll close the walls up with our English dead because I'm about to blow your tiny little minds.
This is Past Force.
Every list of English monarchs starts with Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great wasn't an English monarch. He was a member of the House of Wessex and was only King of Wessex. He wasn't even the first King of Wessex. There were Kings of Wessex before him. And the whole legitimacy of the House of Wessex was built on their ancestry, who they were descended from. They were the descendants of Cerdic. So Alfred the Great, even though he is always at the top of the list, never was. In fact, the first king of all England as we know it was Athelstan, uniting the country in 927. And he was followed by Edmund the Elder, Edgar, Edwy, who had an orgy at his coronation, and then we reach Edgar the Peaceable, or Peaceful, who declares himself emperor over all Britain. And just like the wonderful thing about Tiggers, he's the only one. So following Edgar, who is never called emperor, we get Edward the Martyr, known in Yorkshire as Edward to Martyr. He is followed by his son, Ethelred, who is called the Unready. And no, he wasn't ill-prepared, more like ill-advised. The name comes from the Old English unreid, meaning ill-advised. And because he was ill-advised, that led to a Viking invasion with Sweyn. Although Sweyn is, most of the time, never included in the official list, because he died before he was crowned. So instead we get Edmund, followed by the Vikings of Canute, Harold, and Harthacnut, who was much less the man his father was. In fact, you could say he was half the man his father was. Then the real problems start because we get the Norman conquest. Edward the Confessor in 1066 dies, allegedly having promised William of Normandy the throne, even though the throne wasn't his to promise, and William's claim was based on a system that the English at the time didn't use. So instead we end up with Harold Godwinson, who, at the Battle of Hastings, gets allegedly shot in the eye with an arrow and dies. But he's followed by William the Conqueror, right? Wrong. Because after that we get Edgar the Atheling, who is never included on the official lists because he was never crowned, and he was only king for like 3 weeks. So instead we get William the Conqueror. So after him we get William Rufus, followed by Henry the Lion. And he declares before his death, because of a disaster involving his son and a white ship, in which his son dies, that his daughter, Matilda, is going to rule the country after him. Except, no. We get Stephen instead. Stephen takes the crown. And he officially is king for most of the next however many years. Unless you agree with Henry, in which case Matilda is the queen. And she is officially queen for a period. And at one point she calls herself Empress. And just like the wonderful thing about Tiggers, she's the only one. Eventually this entire civil war gets sorted out, and we get Matilda's son, Henry, who, in an act of style, substance, decides to borrow an idea from the French in which he declares his son, Henry, co-king. This wouldn't be a problem, except, do you think that the younger Henry was king in his own right, or was he just a puppet of his father? Then we get Richard the Lionheart and that good-for-nothing Prince John, who in 1216 gets poisoned. And then following him we have Louis. The French, they invade us. Louis is declared king, Prince Louis of France, but he's never included on the official lists because A, he's a French invader, and B, the Pope sent him home, and C, he was never crowned, just like Edgar the Atheling, just like Matilda. So instead we get my 23 times great-grandfather, who is also number 23, Henry. Now, boys and girls, this is where the fun begins. Because we get a man who looks like Voldemort, followed by a man with exactly the same name, and a third man with exactly the same name. All Edwards. So how do you tell them apart? I know what we'd do. We'll use that French system, the system the French use for their kings. What we'll do is we'll number them to tell them apart. Up till this point they've all had nicknames. So what we'll do is we'll call them Edward the First, Second and Third. Simple, right? Except no, not simple, because then they backdate the numbering system. So Henrys, we get Henry 1, 2, 3, even though technically there have been 4 Henrys. We get William I and William II, but they only go back to the Norman Conquest. So essentially, they ignore the 3 Edwards that came beforehand. This might be alright if the next king wasn't a Richard and Richard II. Even though England already has a Richard, there's now Wales to factor into the mix because in 1282 the guy that looked like Voldemort takes over the country. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that it took 200 years to conquer Wales, and the backdated monarchs, well, who counts depends on where you are in Wales and when. It is, in short, a complete and utter shit show. So, next we get Henry IV, who in Wales, or in parts of Wales, is in fact Henry I. And this continues with Henry V and Henry VI. And it gets worse again with Edward IV. Then we get Edward V, who is never crowned, but who is always included on the official lists, despite previous kings who were never crowned, and one lady, not being included for various reasons, one of which is that they were never crowned. And yet Edward V, despite ruling for less time than some of them, is always included. He is followed by a horse, get me a bloody horse, Richard III. Good or bad, you decide. And then comes Snow White and the 6 Tudors. What happened to the 7th Tudor? Nobody knows. The Henrys, we know, are already screwed up. The Edwards are now even more screwed up if you don't want to count Edward V. If you want to go with the no crowned rule, technically he could be Edward V, or Edward the God knows what. Then comes Lady Jane Grey. Shorty. Queen for 9 days, never crowned. Not included on the official lists, sometimes. So after 9 days, Lady Jane Grey is replaced by Mary and her co-regent Philip of Spain, who is officially king, yet because he's Philip of Spain and in 1588 he tries to invade us with a massive armada, he's never actually counted on the official lists, despite being officially king, or the co-owner of all his wife's titles, as the documents say, making him Queen. That's followed by Queen Elizabeth. And if you think things were confusing so far, you ain't seen nothing yet, because here comes Scotland and we get James I and VI. They take on 2 numbers. And things could get even more confusing if his son had taken over. That is, his son Henry, but Henry dies in 1612. So instead, we get Charles, and we get a shit show of a different kind, namely the English Civil War. Then, just to kick the Irish in the teeth, Oliver Cromwell, despite never being king, never being crowned, is always on the list. And his son Richard, who was also Lord Protector like Cromwell, his father, is never included. Then comes Charles II, James II and VII, and then, because the English decide they don't want a Catholic on the throne, we get William III and Mary II. Mary II, that's okay, everyone's had 2 Marys now, but William III, in Scotland he's only William II, and in Wales he's William I. Then we get Olivia Colman, and she dies after all her children, and because of the Catholic thing, we get the German Hanoverians. And here we need to ask ourselves another question. Do we use the names these monarchs used at the time, i.e. their actual names, or do we use modern English equivalents? In that case, the king known as Henry I would be Henri, and Henry II would be Henri II. But then, where would Henry IV be, Henry VIII, who was actually Henry? Well, in that case we have Georg I, Georg II, and George III. Absolute flipping madness. George III is followed by the Prince Regent, and then we get William IV. Same problem as the previous William. He's followed by Queen Victoria, who has daddy issues. And then we get Edward VII, who is only Edward VII in Wales. In Scotland he's Edward I. In England he's Edward X. George V, and then Edward VIII. Again, never crowned, abdicated a year into his reign, friends with Adolf Hitler, allegedly, and yet always included on the official lists. Then we get George VI, and if you think things couldn't get even more complicated, well, in the 1950s, the Scottish noticed this numbering problem when we get Elizabeth II, and they say, whoa, hang on there lad, Elizabeth II, we never even had Elizabeth I. What are we going to do about this? So rather than come up with any sensible solution, they come up with the spectacular idea that it's whichever number has the highest value wins. That is the one you use, except in the case of James I and James II, in England. And since British monarchs can use whatever names they want, this could become a real problem within our lifetimes. Because when, or if, Prince George becomes our Dark Lord and Master, he could call himself Alexander. In which case we're all...
History! It's a thing of the past!
It's a thing of the past.